Good morning, everyone. My name is David Mettler. I'm the research agronomist here at Southern Minnesota Beet Sugar Cooperative. And first of all, I'd just like to thank the previous presenters, Dr. Wyatt, Eric Branch, Shook. They've really laid out what I'm going to talk about for our CLS program, talked about all the really hard things, so I can kind of breeze through this a little bit and just highlight a few of the main points. I'm going to talk a little bit also about some of the trial work we've done, and then also looking at rhizoctonia and some nutrient management research that we've done the last couple of years. So for our Cercospora leaf spots fungicide trials, we do these every year looking at a few different types of trials. One thing we're looking at, is this the pointer? Oh, here we go. Looking at fungicide screening trials, really what we're doing there is looking at individual products or tank mixes and how effective they are compared to one another. And this gives us an opportunity to screen potentially new products that aren't out in the market yet, and also just look at products and how they're performing over time compared to one another. We also run a program trial, and that's really looking at maybe alternating which fungicide is applied first or second in the program, switching up the tank mix partners, or maybe changing the intervals, things like that. Today I'm just going to talk about the fungicide screening trial and just a few things on how the trials are conducted. Dr. Branch talked about this a little bit earlier and how they are, and it's pretty similar for us. We do inoculate our trials. We apply ours on with a Gandy air unit across the entire field. And then we have this nice 4-row hooded sprayer where we treat the center 4 rows of a 6-row plot. So we have rows 1 and 6 that are untreated that work as a really nice check throughout the season, but also serve as an additional inoculum source throughout the season, putting pressure on these treatments. These are rated on a 1 to 9 scale, and that's done by several members of our research group. Usually 4 or 5 of us get out there for every time period that we do these ratings. So the numbers that I show are an average of all those ratings for that particular date. These trials are also harvested for yield, center 2 rows. I'm not going to talk about yield today. We're just going to look at the disease ratings. So this is the scale that we have, the 1 to 9 Cercospora leaf spot scale, and this is a little different than what you've seen in the past. We had this animated disease scale that we've shown before. Lindsay Nass has worked on getting some real-life pictures with disease on them to kind of show it's a lot easier to see, I think, the amount of leaves that we have on here. So 1, very clean. It could maybe have a spot or 2 on it, right? Compared to a 5 here is where we start to get that, economical damage, right? We're getting to that threshold. And then the 9 is, brown, crispy leaves with a lot of regrowth occurring out there in the canopy. So this is data from our CLS fungicide screening trial this year. This is not all of our treatments. I just wanted to highlight a few things from here. Again, our scale here is on the x-axis, 1 through 9, and then our treatments here on the y-axis. This is just from September 27th, so right before harvest for us. The check or untreated control is here on the top. You can see we are rating about an 8 at this time. Cooper Fix Ultra is a copper product. It's a basic copper sulfate. I also tested some other copper products that have hydroxide or oxychloride. They all perform very similar, so I just have the one on here just for the sake of readability and space. As you can see, our copper products are fungicidal, right, against CLS. We dropped the disease rating about 2 points. However, not quite as good as Manzate Pro Stick that we're using here. And so that's why Manzate has been our preferred tank mix partner, right? It's just performed better and more consistent over time. But copper is still a valuable tank mix partner if we need that at the end of the season. A couple other things I want to point out in this slide is just the benefit of tank mixing, right? And we've talked about this a lot before, but it's just worth pointing out again. So tank mixing some of our DMIs, like a LunaFlex, ProLine with Manzate Pro Stick really drops that disease score, right? So it just highlights the value of tank mixing. Other thing to point out, I have a few other DMI or triazoles here. They all perform pretty similarly, other than ProLine being our lowest disease rating for this trial, and it has been for a number of years. That tank mix is just a really good application. And Supertin also performed pretty well this year in comparison to other years for our trial. Other thing to note here is the check is only at an 8. So this is a susceptible variety, right? Generally speaking, with no applications, we would see burn down a little earlier in the season for our trials. We did get enough disease pressure, as you can see, to have some nice separation in our treatments. However, we did have some difficulties at this trial site. We were south of the river over by Wood Lake, and we just had a lot of rainfall early in the season, didn't get planted quite as early as a lot of the other trials and your fields. And then we also received a lot of rainfall after planting, right? So we just struggled to get to canopy so we could inoculate and get some nice disease pressure. So that's why we don't have quite as high as ratings as we've had in the past. So just like we faced difficulties in 2024 with some of our trial work, obviously you, the growers, faced a lot of difficulties, right? I mean, that goes without saying. We had an early start, which is usually a great sign for sugar beets, right? But unfortunately that was followed by a really wet spring and early summer. And so CLS was able to take off earlier this year with that early spring, and unfortunately, we just couldn't get out in the field to make timely applications in a lot of cases. This environmental stress also led to diseased leaf complexes, like Dr. Chana talked about. We've got a lot of different things going on here in these canopies. We had alternaria, stemphylium, bacterial leaf spot, as well as CLS. So some of our fields were looking pretty bad here this season. Another thing is that we likely ended too early on some of our fields. Unfortunately, with the new DIV matrix that Dr. Secor and others are working on, showing the importance of free moisture, it's not only that high temperature and humidity, right, but if we get a high amount of dew occurring in September, even if it is a little cooler out, we can have that free moisture for a long period of time overnight and into the morning that can be very bad for CLS infections. So this means that we likely need to have a spray in early September to have that coverage through the month of September. Because as we noticed, even with CR Plus varieties, we could go from a 2 to a 6 during the month of September in that 4 to 5 week period there if we don't have any protection. We were watching that in our Cercospora leaf spot nurseries and trials this year, and it progressed very quickly without any protection. I just want to highlight a few things from some of the earlier presenters. So this is latent infection testing, or that early testing that Dr. Wyatt did, and this is specifically SMBSC. So looking at this graph, we can see percent of field detection, and you can see it's on a weekly basis, right? So we don't have these tests going every single day, right? So we can't quite see a nice graph, but we have this jump here in 2024 from June 14th to June 21st. Compared to 2022 and 2023, it was a little bit later, starting in that June 21st to June 28th week. So CLS did get started a little bit earlier this year on us. It just highlights the importance of that early application. In addition to that early season infection testing, we also did end of season resistance testing. The agricultural staff sampled 141 fields from our cooperative. We saw similar results for the CR Plus and the traditional varieties, so the data is just combined together because we didn't see any differences in resistance. So this is looking at the DMIs, and again, this data is specifically SMBSC. We're looking at percent of field, Here we go. We're looking at percent of field sampled here for EC50 values greater than 10, and these are the different DMIs or triazole products we're looking at. And basically all you need to look in this graph is that we're seeing a slight downward trend in resistance levels for our DMIs. So that's great news, right? We're not seeing any increase in disease resistance for these. Compare that to tin. We're looking at the percent of fields sampled with any amount of resistance in them, right? So this is just that there's some amount of spores that are resistant in this field. And if we're looking at the percent of fields sampled here, you can see we had high levels in 21 and 22. And when we dropped tin or reduced the amount of applications we made in 23, we had a lot lower levels of resistance at the end of the season. So that worked out really well. Unfortunately, we used tin in 24, and that resistance jumped right back up to previous levels, right? It's not all bad news though, because if you look at the amount of spores in each of these fields that were actually resistant, that level was still low. So we're down to about 30% of the individual spores within those fields that are resistant. That means 70% are still susceptible to tin, right? So that's still good news. It's not quite as low as 2023, but it is certainly much lower than 21 and 22. So tin is still a valuable tank mix partner moving into 2025. This is our QOI fungicide resistance testing at the end of the season. Again, we just have high levels of resistance at the end of the season. However, this is a slide from Dr. Secor kind of just explaining how we might see high levels of resistance at the end of the season, but in our early season resistance testing, we're seeing susceptibility, right? So for example, we have, I keep pushing the wrong button. We have high levels of resistance in the fall of 2020, and then we have a susceptible population in the spring in our spore traps. And this is a trend that we've seen now over the last couple of years, that we have high resistance in the fall, but some susceptibility in the spring. So before I get into the program, I just want to kind of summarize where we are with CLS at Southern Minnesota Beech Sugar Cooperative right now. So as the previous presenters already talked about, we've been selecting for strains that can affect CR+. So if you recall, Dr. Wyatt's was a really nice graph showing how the population has changed over time with the advent and introduction of CR+ varieties. And we now have strains that are widely present in our cooperative that can infect CR+ varieties. And unfortunately, with all the wet weather and rain that we had this year, we have a high level of inoculum from those strains going in from 2024 into our 2025 crop, right? So those strains are going to be present throughout our cooperative. We have an open winter, right? You guys have noticed that the dirt's blowing. Well, that means the spores are moving with it too, likely, and it's not going to be isolated to wherever these fields were. I'm sure these spores have blown around all over the cooperative by now. And again, just to reiterate that once infection occurs, it can progress quickly, right? We talked about how that early season application is really important to control those first spores that are trying to infect our sugar beets. And if we can control those ones, then we have a lot better chance of maintaining control throughout the rest of the season. So this is the CLS program for 2025. You'll note that I said the CLS program, and that's because we have one program for 2025 that we're recommending. So again, the importance of starting early. We're looking at starting before canopy closure. You know, hopefully that's around like maybe 4 inches apart between the leaves. You can kind of still row or see down the rows as you're driving by. Or we're looking kind of at that time period right around that June 21st. We're really starting to see that latent infection disease testing kick off. And that's really when we're starting to see that row closure kind of coinciding, right? Because we have that microclimate that CLS likes to take advantage of in our canopy. Applications on approximately a 14-day interval. Again, this is approximately, right? We need to have a flexible program that is a little dependent on the weather. And so if we have a high amount of rainfall that occurs after you made an application, well, a lot of our fungicides are protected fungicides, right? And they're susceptible to wash off. So you might need to shorten the interval after a rainfall event. Likewise, if it's a dry September, and we haven't had a lot of rain, the DOVs are low, potentially you can stretch out the interval, right? So this is why we're saying approximately a 14-day interval, weather dependent. So looking at our first application, we'd like to come out strong with a good tank mix, looking at Proline or generic plus EBDC. Again, in last year's testing and in multiple years, Proline plus EBDC has been our best tank mix partner for disease control. And again, this is in the first DMI resistance group that would include other products like Enable, TopGuard, and the tetraconazoles, right? Second tank mix application would be a tin product plus Topsin or T-methyl. Dr. White already talked about why this is a great tank mix combination, so I'm not going to get into that, but that's the second application that we'd like to go forward with. Our third application would be a QOI or a Strobi plus EBDC. So for example, a gem or headline type of product. And again, Dr. White talked about this, but we go out with a DMI application that reduces the susceptibility of the population for an application of a QOI, and also earlier in the season when we have a more susceptible population. So we believe that a QOI application following a DMI earlier in the season will be a good combination for us for control. Again, switching from a DMI or Strobe to a tin, and then back to our other DMI group. So Inspire XT, Provosol, or one of the generics, right? We want to go from one resistance group of DMI to the other one, so we're only using one application of one of those products in a season. And then for our sixth application, tin plus EBDC. So at this point, if we started in the third to fourth week of June, we should be getting close to the end of August or beginning of September for this sixth application, which would give us coverage into September. But if it's wet or it's just that kind of a year, right? If we need to make a seventh application, we can do that. We have another EBDC plus copper. And actually, this is only 6 applications of EBDC. There's still a seventh one available, right? But we're broadening our mode of actions that we're using, right? We're reducing our exposure to any one particular and just trying to broaden our base and control more of this disease. Again, that's only the chemistry side of the program, right? We still have to keep in mind our BMPs for application. Again, spray volume, very important, trying to get coverage on all the leaves. And then looking at our nozzles, just making sure that we're following manufacturer recommendations for our pressure on these nozzles to achieve a medium droplet size, right? We don't want to change our pressure so that way we can change our speed and volume, our spray volume. We want to change our nozzle. Maybe it's a larger orifice size or just a different type of nozzle to get that medium droplet size, because we don't want to be getting a bunch of driftable fines that don't bring us coverage to the canopy. We can also use a deposition aid, reduce our driftable fines, and also get that spread on the leaf for better coverage. And then again, just keeping in mind the weather conditions. This is our CLS quick sheet. It has the program on it, as well as the BMPs in a lot more information there. And also information on all the individual products, REIs, PHIs, things like that. We'll have a bunch of handouts available for you guys, maybe after lunch here or at the end of the day that you can pick up from the tables. And it's also going to be posted on our website by the end of the week here. Okay, before I go into anything else, I just wanted to pause and see if you guys had any questions on the first half of my presentation. And if there's a lot, then we'll just skip the second half. Yes?
So we've swung pretty heavily to the CR Plus trade.
Yes.
Is there being changes made to the seed program now when we have to spray the same on both? We're paying for a product that we have to spray like traditional. Is there going to be more traditional varieties brought forward so we don't have to be paying that and it's not covering us the way it was?
Right. So basically, in a nutshell, the question is, we're paying for a trait that's supposed to reduce the amount of applications or the cost of a fungicide program, and are there going to be any changes to the seed inventory available of different genetics because of that? I think, I can't answer that question really. That's kind of up to the seed companies. We have choices, right? But one thing I would mention too is that if you look at the top varieties that we have available, a lot of our top varieties as far as yield are CR Plus varieties. So we are still getting a benefit to those varieties as they are, good varieties, right? But as far as the cost of everything, that's outside of my control.
So that is a good question, and one of the things that we have is we have a strong pipeline of both seeds in our program, and we want to keep that. We want to maintain that leverage. But we also know that the final deciders, the people that on the farms that are writing those checks and making those decisions are the final choice, and that really the supply of seed will reflect those choices. And I think the thing that we can do to manage that is to make sure that we don't leave anything on the table per se with preemptively narrowing the supply of seed or the choices of seed as we go forward. So I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
And just want to add to that too, it's not saying there isn't a value to that trait, right? It's still providing protection against a lot of other strains. It's just that we have some strains that are able to infect it. So there is still value to having that stack trait over just the traditional trait. Other questions?
We have been So I forgot to mention, for the last 2.5 years, I would say, we've been testing our isolates that are collected against EBDCs, and we still have found no resistance. So that's still a very effective application.
Yes.
Can you go back to your quick sheet?
Yes.
Putting the straight strobe in on spray 3, is that, I don't see like Beltma on the list as a tank mix. Do you not want that being used because it's got a strobe in it later in the season?
So the question is, there's not Veltima on the list, and so Veltima is a premix, right, of a strobe and Provosol and a strobe, right? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to separate our main chemistries, right? So we're trying to only apply one DMI from each group, and so we're not trying to combine, say, a QOI with a triazole, right? We're trying to separate our chemistries out a little bit and tank mix them with an EBDC or one of the other tank mix partners, not a DMI with a strobe or a DMI with a tin, right? Like a Minerva Duo or something like that. So we're trying to separate our tank mix partners a little bit there. So that'd be the reason for that. Oh, sorry. Well, this first, yeah.
Is the headline or what's in Preaxer or Veltima the only strobe you're considering when you say strobe?
No, so I mentioned GEM as well. So GEM headline, that's a good point. I skipped over that earlier. So another strobe that we have in the market is azoxystrobin, right? And we use that heavily for rhizoctonia control. And historically, azoxystrobin has not performed as well on Cercospora leaf spot as these other products such as headline or GEM or Preaxer. Thank you. Right, so this is pretty late in the season, right? I mean, we're talking fairly large beets, and we're not going to be getting a lot of product down to the roots where we're really going to be controlling rhizoctonia. And the reason here for placing the strobe after the DMI is that, as Dr. Wyatt showed, applying a DMI ahead of the strobe makes that population a little more susceptible to control from the QOI, right? It reduces the resistance profile of the population to a strobe when you apply a DMI first. So that's the reason for having the QOI after a DMI application. Good question, though. Yes?
More of a timing question and weather. So if I'm approaching my window to spray and the rain is coming, am I better off to go out there a day or two earlier before the rain have coverage, or am I better off to let the rain and get out there with my sprayer or the airplane? Any thoughts of timing of that?
Yeah, so Harmony, really great question, right? So we get this question a lot in the season, right? So the question is, there's rain coming, right? So do I spray a little bit early before the rain, or do I wait until after the rain? Well, there's a lot of factors that go into that, and if you could tell me how much it was going to rain, that would help me answer the question. But I'll point out a couple things. So some of these products are strictly protective, right? They're just on the leaf surface. They're probably going to wash away quite a bit with a significant rainfall event, depending how intense the rainfall is, right? So for example, that'd be like our EBDCs, tin, copper, they're all kind of just on the surface, right? However, our DMIs, or strobe or topsin, they're kind of at least a little bit translaminar, where they'll get into the leaf a little bit so they won't just wash off right away from a heavy rainfall. So it kind of depends on which fungicides you're applying first if you want to go ahead of the rain. So you could, if you had something you could put on that at least make sure it was part of the tank mix, it wasn't just a tin EBDC ahead of the rain, say it was one of the other products that was at least somewhat translaminar. That would be one consideration to make. The other, yes, we can apply with an airplane after the rain, so that way our product isn't washing off. And once it dries out, we could go and border the field perhaps with another product where the airplane couldn't quite get the corners and stuff. Maybe it's an EBDC. Because we have an extra EBDC available, it wouldn't mess up the rest of your program if you applied your tank mix, or had the airplane apply your tank mix and then just boarded the field with an EBDC after that. That'd also be a potential option. And again, these scenarios are going to be many, right, in the season, and that's one thing you might want to just make sure that you're calling your agriculturalist or your consultant, and just let them be a sounding board for you to figure out what the best plan is. Excellent. Any other questions? Yes.
Why 10 ounces of Thompson instead of 20?
That is an excellent question. So basically, the question is why 10 ounces of Thompson instead of 20? That's something that Thompson has been historically used at that rate, and part of the reason is that having the resistance to Thompson is basically either it is or it isn't resistant, right? So increasing the amount of product isn't really going to increase your amount of control. Compared to, say, one of the DMI or the tin, right, we have a profile of resistance, whether it's highly resistant, somewhat susceptible, or highly susceptible, where the rate might actually make a difference on that compared to the Thompson product. And if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free. Oh, there you are. Yeah, so just to repeat what Ashok said, right, we have a tank mix going out there, right? It's not just Thompson alone that you'd maybe want to consider a higher rate. You have tin out there as well, so it's a tank mix. Yeah.
Are you adjuvants a part of your recommendation or not?
So the question is, are pine and adjuvants part of my recommendation, our recommendation? I don't have any conclusive data to say that pine and adjuvants are better than other adjuvants as far as Cercospora leaf spot control. That's not something that we've seen in the trial research. I would recommend an adjuvant that helps in deposition, so reducing spray drift and also getting coverage on the leaf. I'm not going to tell you can't use a pine and adjuvant. You're certainly welcome to do so if that's something that you think would help. But we just don't have any data to support that. Other questions? Otherwise, I am here all day, but how much time do I have? Okay, keep going. Yeah, okay. Okay, moving on to other things, and I might try to speed this up a little bit, but we also do some Rhizoctonia trials in addition to Cercospora leaf spot. These trials are located generally by the OVT nurseries where we screen varieties. And in these trials, what we're really looking at is comparing the application method of the fungicide as well as comparing individual fungicides to see what their effectiveness is. These are inoculated trials. We get infected barley inoculum from Dr. Chanda, and it works really well. And we either apply these products in furrow with our planter, or we use our Bright sprayer, as you can see here, either banded or broadcast. We do harvest these trials, center 2 rows of 6-row plots, and we also take stand counts 3-4 times throughout the season. And then we rate them for disease as these beets come up on the lifter. We're on a 1 to 7 scale, so 1 being disease-free, and then 7, you got rotten spider beets out there, really. So I'm not going to go through all the trials from last year. What I really want to do is just focus in on some common treatments I had between 23 and 24. So this is the rot rating, again, on the y-axis, 1 to 7. And then I have my treatments here on the x-axis. Blue is 23, orange is 24. And the control here is around a 3.5. And just a couple things I want to point out on here is, we do have 2 different active ingredients available to control Rhizoctonia in furrow or post, other options too, but I'm focusing more on the SDHI and azoxystrobin type products here. So Elatus is a premix of an SDHI and azoxystrobin, and then we have Quadris, which is obviously azoxystrobin along with Asteroid, and then Excalia, which is strictly just an SDHI. And what we're looking at here is not seeing a lot of difference between the banded and broadcast Quadris. Very similar here in 24, a little bit of a difference in 23. But the main thing I want to point out is that the broadcast Excalia looks pretty good in comparison to the azoxystrobin, where it's similar or a little bit better. And so just sharing some data from Dr. Peters, I don't want to get into how the trial was conducted or anything too much because we don't have time, but basically what he was doing was looking at Quadris or azoxystrobin in comparison to Excalia in tank mixes, right? And this is mostly looking at herbicide or insecticide applications in the season here. So looking at this picture, we have Excalia in the background and Quadris in the front here. And you can see that there's some little bit of a reduction here in growth with the Quadris when it's tank mixed with some of these combinations. And so basically the message here is that Excalia is safer to combine with a lay-by herbicide program, and you don't want to be mixing Quadris with your lay-by herbicide program. But the Mustang Max was fine. Either one of those could be tank mixed with your Mustang Max. So in a nutshell, that's what I wanted to point out here, is that Excalia is a good option to tank mix and maybe reduce a pass across the field if you're going to make a post-application broadcast. Switching gears to our nitrogen rate placement trials, we've done this for the last couple of years. We're looking at this 360 bandit system. You can kind of see it a little bit in the picture up here. Really what we're doing here is we're trying to see if it's more effective to put nitrogen closer to the row when the beets are emerging early in the season compared to a broadcast urea. And so the UAN that we used was being delivered 3 inches either side of the row, and then 3/4 of an inch deep. So not as deep as you might think with like corn, because we didn't want to disturb our seeds in the furrow there. And then we also conduct some nitrogen rate comparisons looking at 30-pound increments from the residual nitrogen. So nitrogen placement, we're looking specifically at extractable sugar per acre, or ESA, for these following graphs. And we had 2 trial sites this year looking at nitrogen. We had a trial site following field corn just to the northeast of Renville, and then we had a trial site following soybean to the southwest. And really what we're going to point out here is we have our broadcast rates of urea at 30/60, and then we had our UAN either put into the soil with the 360 bandit system, or we turned it and just let it dribble on the surface as well as a comparison. And what you see here on the field corn site is we did not see a benefit to applying the UAN closer to the row, a little bit of a negative there. The soybean site is kind of mixed. It's a little bit noise there with the data. But this is just last year. We've done this trial for the last couple of years, and basically what we've seen is that there's no benefit to applying this UAN closer to the row. It was similar to broadcast, or in some cases the dribble looked worse. And that makes sense, right? You dribble the nitrogen on the surface, it doesn't rain, it's just laying there exposed on the surface, and we lose some of our nitrogen. So at the end of the day, we didn't see a benefit to applying it closer to the row. Looking at nitrogen rate comparison, so this is the same 2 sites, just looking at a nitrogen rate ladder, again going from residual up to 220 pounds or about 200 pounds for the soybean. It just depends on where you started, right? So first thing I want to point out is just this picture. So there are beets in every row in this picture. These are my check plots here on either side. I don't know what this treatment is offhand, but these are my check plots. You can hardly see the beets. My residual nitrogen on this site was about 13 pounds for 4 feet. Like, that was the total amount of residual nitrogen I had, was 13 pounds. And so this is probably the biggest nitrogen deficiency or response that we've seen in any of our trial work we've done. And John Lamb said the same thing, and you guys know how long he's been working in nitrogen. So that's what we were looking at in this field, early season. So again, we got a great response to additional nitrogen, all the way up to around 130 pounds, and then after that it was statistically similar. Our soybean site didn't respond, as drastically, but we did get a nice response from that residual of around 40 pounds up to around 100 pounds, and then statistically similar after that point. So that's just last year's, 2 trial sites that we did, right? I'm working on doing an analysis on a summary of nitrogen rate trials. This would include trials from the last 5 years or so. And really what we're looking at here is 10 trial sites. Most of these are following field corn, 8 of 10, and 2 of them are soybean. And really what we're seeing here is a nice response, going from 70 pounds residual up to that 130. And arguably you could say, well, I want a little insurance here. I'm going to go a little farther to the right. I would never argue with that for following field corn. Looking at this graph, 130 looks great. You want to stay away from the left a little bit. Maybe you want to go at that 150, right? There was no detriment to doing that. Now, again, this is just the means from the trials. I'm still working through the data, the best way to analyze it. So hopefully I'll have a little better graph with maybe some statistics on it later on. Looking at some other macronutrients, we have phosphorus and potassium tests that we've been doing. The potassium sites that we tested, we really just didn't get a response to adding additional potassium to the site, which isn't surprising. If you look at the soil sample results that we had from 2022, 95% of the fields that we tested had sufficient levels of potassium. Didn't need to add any more potassium to these fields. Sugar beets, you really don't need that much more potassium than what's present in the field. Compare that to phosphorus. We did get a response to most of our phosphorus sites, and our recent trials that we've been conducting indicate lower response levels than what are currently recommended in our sugar beet production guide. So this is kind of what the table looks like in the sugar beet production guide if you look at it. And from the fields that we have that were tested, 25% of our fields were in the very high, 25 in the high, 25 in the low, or medium, 25 in the low, just real roughly. And we had very few fields in the very low. We had trials conducted in one we had in a high, one in a low, one in a very low. And I'm going to continue to do this for a few more trial sites. But these are the rates that are recommended if you have that soil test in our book. However, our trial sites for the very high, or the high, did not respond to any additional phosphorus. Our trial site for the low only responded up to 15 pounds of P2O5 being applied, and our very low site only responded up to 30 pounds of additional P2O5. So it looks like we really don't need as much phosphorus applied as what our book currently says, but again, this is only 3 site years, right? So we're just working on this data set. We'll see if that trend continues. Another thing is starter alone also met the phosphorus needs for this low site. So half of our fields likely don't need any phosphorus applied, that high, very high. You get into this medium, you probably want to make sure you're putting a starter on, and you get below that, you're probably going to want to broadcast some P2O5 and probably use a starter. Okay, last thing I'm going to cover real quickly is some fall cover crop work we've been doing. So you guys all know kind of the bad rap we get, right, for the blowing soils following beet harvest, right? So this is something we've been working on since before I came here, looking at how we can establish a fall cover crop. We looked at broadcasting at different timings after harvest. We're looking at mid-September, early October, mid-October, and really the October timings when the majority of our acres are harvested really just doesn't work to get a cover crop established after harvest in most years. Some years it will work. So we're looking at interseeding a fall cover crop, a few weeks ahead of harvest. Get that grain or whatever you're using for your cover crop established, let it start growing ahead of harvest, give it that couple of weeks of warmer temperatures to get going. So we partnered with Hinneker in 2023. We kind of worked on a demo unit and got it working well in sugar beets. And this last year, we went out on a few grower fields, put some strips across using cereal rye at 15 and 30 pounds per acre. This is that unit here, and you probably can't see the cereal rye growing in between the rows here, but it did grow and establish even with the really dry conditions that we planted in. However, after harvest, I went out there and checked on it, and it was covered in probably an inch or more of soil and residue, right? And so I waited a little longer, nothing came up, and I went out there and dug, and I could find the rye. It wasn't destroyed from the harvest process, but it was buried. And it doesn't have a lot of vigorous growth growing in this canopy. I mean, this shades out a lot of sunlight, so the rye wasn't growing really well. It got buried. It just did not have the gumption to get through the soil, right? So it was a good idea. We were able to get it established, but it just did not survive the harvest process. So I just want to thank Dr. Wyatt and Dr. Secor Labs for doing all this resistance testing, right? Doing all this testing in the spring and summer now has kind of opened our eyes a little bit to what's going on more so in the season with the CLS population, and is giving us some more management strategies to use. I'd also like to thank our cooperators, all the different cooperators for these trials that allow us to do this trial work on their land. This research would not be possible without you. And also the research staff. Obviously, I don't do all this work myself. And I will take any questions if I have time, CLS or the second half of the presentation. Perfect, thank you.